If you have a Bible, turn to Matthew chapter 25. We'll be there this morning, Matthew chapter 25. I did want to remind you that this Wednesday, many of us have been encouraged to come on over to Lipscomb on Wednesday night, and there'll be some announcements about that going out this week. But we're kicking off a series over there Wednesday night and Thursday, looking at a man whose life was very influential at this church. As a matter of fact, Willie Cato and Marshall Keeble traveled together, lived life together. You'll hear a little bit about that, but we'll kick that off with a worship service on Wednesday night. And we'll have Orpheus Hayward preaching. He's a grandson in the faith of Marshall Keeble. And then we'll also have Fred Gray there, who was recently given the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He was a son in the faith of Marshall Keeble and will be a part of that as well. There's more about the Thursday program, but I just wanted to remind you, many of us will come over there on Wednesday night at 6:30 to be a part of that. Today I want to ask you another question about how to invest your life. How do we live well? How do we work well? How do we make sure we're honoring God with our work? Because so much of our life is wrapped up in work. And we want to make sure that we do it well and that we honor God through our work and that we see it as part of our discipleship, part of our calling, part of our vocation. And the worry is that many of us will waste the time that we have at work. Others of us will just spend it, but we want to know how to invest our life and our work so that it matters. And I remind you that in Matthew chapter 6, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, because when you do, moth and rust destroy and vermins come in and everything gets ruined. He says, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, because moth and rust cannot destroy and thieves cannot break in and steal. And then he says the key part, where your treasure is, your heart will follow. And so we want to be people that are asking, how do we use the treasures of this earth to invest in the things of heaven and the things that will last? We want to be proactive and not reactive in the way we live. We want to have a plan so that we run the race with perseverance. We buffet our body and we make it our slave so that we can run this race well and not be disqualified. Last week I tried to say to you, if you aim at nothing, you'll hit it every time. But how do we live intentionally? And it requires that we take personal responsibility for our life and for our choices. And so today I want to talk to you, part 2 on this series, about taking ownership and understanding ownership and the principle of ownership and what that looks like for each of us. You may have heard this quote long ago from Maimonides, who said, "Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime." Have y'all heard that before? Well, I want to tell you about this guy. His name is John Perkins. I got to meet him a couple of times. He was a minister in Mississippi. And this is what John Perkins had to say about Maimonides and his quote. He thought about it for a long time, and then he added this little piece to it. It's not just teaching a man to fish that will allow him to eat for a lifetime. In the end, it comes down to who owns the pond. Isn't that interesting? Who owns the pond? So that's the question I want us to be wrestling with today, is who owns the pond? And let's talk about it from the principle of ownership. I want to take you on a little journey. We'll start with the book of Genesis again, like we did last week. And then we'll ask the question, what if God owns it all? And we'll end with, so what? And so let's jump in. The starting point is Genesis. We keep coming back to Genesis because it's the origin of everything. The word Genesis actually means beginnings, and we find all these beginnings happening in the book of Genesis. And so we see it's the beginning of creation. It's the beginning of everything. And on the 6th day, at the completion of it, God, it says, looked at all that, what? He had made and said it was very good. The Hebrew writer says in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 3, it's by faith that we understand that the universe was formed at God's command. God spoke it all into existence, right? But notice what else it says. It says that everything God created came from nothing. He's the starting point. He's the originator of everything. That there's nothing that doesn't have its origin in God. So think about that. If God created everything from nothing, the God who created it all, therefore, owns it all. So we began to read last week and we discover that if God created us, if God formed us, if God breathed into us the breath of life, then God has ownership over us. It's because of Him that we live, that we breathe, and we have our being. We also discover that God's the one who put us to work. And we began to ask the question, did God make us for work? And Genesis 2 tells us that He does. But now we ask ourselves, does the one who created us have a right to expect us to work? And of course, the answer is yes. So we ask ourselves, who owns the pond? And the answer to that question is, God created it, God sustains it, therefore God owns it all. And so I want you to catch this point. Can you say it out loud with me? God owns it all. But it's a little more complicated than that, right? Wouldn't you agree it's a little bit more complicated than that God owns it all? I think so. So let's wrestle with it for a minute. What if God owns it all? What does that mean? So let's look at the Psalms and see what they say about God's ownership and why. The earth, the psalmist says, is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and everything in it. Why does the psalmist say that? Well, look in verse 2. It's because God founded it on the seas. He established it upon the waters. No one else can claim anything about creation. In Job 38, Job is dressed down by God. Where were you when I created all this? Where were you when I hung the stars in the sky? Where were you when I made the tides work the way they do? And where were you? God created it all. God owns it all. Look what the psalmist says in Psalm 50. God says, I have no need of bulls from your stall or goats from your pen, for every animal of the forest is whose? Mine. And the cattle on 1,000 hills belong to me. I know every bird in the mountains and the insects in the fields, they're all mine. Even the mosquitoes, when I slap them, God owns them. If I were hungry, I would not tell you for what? The world is mine and all that is within it. Do you see? The Psalms make it clear. But here's the question that we're wrestling with. If God owns it all, why does Satan claim it's his? Isn't there a challenge going on in this world and about the possessions that we have? Don't we wrestle with whether God owns it all, Satan owns it all? What's going on? Well, let's think about it for a minute, and let's always remember that Satan is a liar and the father of lies. But let's look at the life of Jesus and let's try to figure out, how do we understand possessions and the ownership of them? And so let's go to the desert where Jesus was tempted for 40 days. And you remember this passage from Luke chapter 4. Look what it says. It says, the devil led him up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to him, I will give you authority and splendor. It has been given to me. And I can give it to anyone I want If you worship me, it will be yours. What does Satan claim? It's been given to me, so I can give it to you. Now, does Jesus say, it has not been given to you? What's Jesus' reply? It is written, worship your God and serve him only. Jesus knew that there was a challenge going on, a temptation going on about ownership and how we should understand these things. And he's saying that, look, my loyalty is to God who created it all. My understanding of where things derive is not from you, but from God. I'm not giving you credit for creating anything. I'm not giving you credit for sustaining anything. I understand that you have the capacity to influence through these things, but I know who owns them. And I am not going to get confused. In the book of John, Jesus calls the devil the ruler of this world. The ruler of this world. The ruler of this world. Paul calls Satan the god of this world, small g. And we realize that, okay, there is this battle going on over possessions and over ownership. Look with me in the book of Job for a minute and think way back. Look what it says in Job, beginning in chapter 1, verse 6. It says, one day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan also came with them. Interesting. The Lord said to Satan, where have you come from? And Satan answered, I've been roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it, basically wreaking havoc. Verse 8, God says, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. Upright, blameless, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Now look with me. Verse 9. Does Job fear God for nothing? Satan replied. Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. What does it say? The Lord said to Satan, very well then, everything he has is in your power. But on the man himself, don't lay a finger. Who owns it all? God does. Who created it all? Who sustains it all? Where does it all derive from? God. But there's some sense in which Satan has been given capacity to use the things of this earth to influence, to divert our affection, and to cause us to shift our loyalty away from God. And we realize that. That's why Jesus says, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate one and love the other, you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. And I know Harvey Floyd's wife is listening in this morning, so let me add that the last thing I ever heard Harvey Floyd say was, after reading this passage, you cannot serve both God and money, and those are your only two choices. Paul says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And by it, many have left the faith and pierced themselves with so many sorrows. And so we all like to say this, money is not evil, the love of money is evil. Don't we like to say that? But let's ask the question then, what is money? What is it? Ephesians chapter 6. Paul tells us that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but we wrestle against principalities and powers and rulers of the darkness of this world against spiritual wickedness in high places. In other words, sometimes we like to pretend like money is just neutral. Like you can put it on the table and it has no power. But here's the thing. If I put money on the table and I also put a Kleenex on the table, and you take the Kleenex, no one's calling the police. Why are you calling the police when you pick up one piece of paper and you're not calling the police when you pick up another piece of paper? Because one piece of paper has power. There's something going on. It can be used for good in amazing ways, but it also has power to divert towards devastating harm. The same piece of money. And so the principle we need to hear today is that God owns it all. The battle is whether we will live like it. That's the battle, isn't it? Don't we all know in our mind that God owns it all? But how will we live? So let's think about this just quickly. The parable of the talents, Matthew chapter 25, beginning in verse 14. Hopefully you read it a few times this week. You'll be challenged to read it a few more times next week. But look how it starts. Matthew 25, verse 14. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. Note, to entrust something to another is to place it under another's stewardship. It does not transfer ownership, right? If I entrust something to you, the idea is I'm going to come back for it later. It's entrusted to you for my behalf, on my behalf. It's been entrusted to you. And what Jesus says is that we have been entrusted with gifts from God. They've been entrusted to you for a period of time. They're under your stewardship. But God has not transferred ownership to you. And so the principle of ownership this morning is understanding that God's wealth has been entrusted to you. Turn to the person next to you and say, God's wealth has been entrusted to me. God's wealth has been entrusted to me. Say it boldly, like you really are happy about that fact, right? God's entrusted His blessings on me, but God did not transfer ownership. That's the hard part, isn't it? God has not transferred ownership. What it says is He entrusted His wealth to me. Now you may wonder about socialism. Then should we all get the same? Look at the next verse. He gave some 5 bags, and we'll get to this more in a couple of weeks. Others 2 bags, and others 1 bag. Everybody got what? According to their ability. And then He went away. And as you read this week, 2 put their talents to work, 1 didn't. We'll talk about that more. But everyone had to give an accounting for what they did. And here's the big question that the master asked. What did you do with what was mine that I entrusted to you? Have you thought about the fact that you will be asked that question one day? What did you do with what was mine that I entrusted to you? And the answer that we hope for is well done, good and faithful servant. Think about Abraham, just really quickly. Look at all the times that he trusted in God and God's ownership of everything. That's why he's called the father of the faithful. It's because he models for us what it looks like to trust that God owns everything. The cattle on 1,000 hills belong to him. All the animals of the kingdom belong to him. And so he lives as one who trusts in God. You might remember the story about Lot and the argument over property and which way should we go. And Abraham just says, look, I trust God. You go this way, I go that way. You go that way, I go this way. I'm good. I trust God. You just see it over and over and over again that God blessed him, but Abraham kept trusting in God, that God owned it all. Melchizedek shows up. He gives a tenth of everything to Melchizedek to show his trust in God. When the king tries to give gifts to Abraham, Abraham says, I'm not taking any of your money. Do you remember why? Because he said, what I have comes from God, and I don't want you to take credit for it. God owns it all. God has entrusted it to me, and I'm going to use it well to honor him. And so we begin to see, even in Abraham, is one who trusted God and the ownership that God has over everything. So, last week I challenged you as you begin to begin with the end in mind. To ask yourself the question, what do you want said about you when the master returns? And you give an accounting for what you did with what was entrusted to you. Just understand that that day is coming when we will all give an account for what we did with what was given to us. But today I want us to build upon that, and I want us to realize that all's well that ends well is true, but all's well that begins well is often the key. To begin well is to understand that God owns it all, and to live our life realizing that, living into that God really does own it all, that I can trust God because the cattle on 1,000 hills belong to him. I can trust God because all the wealth in the world belongs to him. He can handle my broken car. He can handle my leaking roof. He can handle a tuition bill. He can handle all those things that just seem to be so big. Isn't that silly, the things that we worry about when God owns it all? So read the parable a few more times this week. Think about what it means. And begin asking yourself what it means if God truly owns it all. It's going to bother you this week because you're going to want to say, that's mine. And all of a sudden, you're going to hear this voice that says, is it really yours? Somebody's going to want to borrow something, and you're not going to want to let them borrow it. And then you're going to remember, oh, yeah, it's God's. Oh, yeah, it's God's. We play this game, and the goal of it is to acquire more and more and more until you own it all, right? And what we have to remember, this is so important. The things you own end up owning you. Anything you don't turn over to God and say, God, it's your car, God, it's your house, God, it's all yours, it's going to end up owning you. So you have to transfer ownership to the one who owns it all anyway. And trust him. And understand that money, wealth, mammon is the God that is trying to control you. It's trying to get you not to trust in God. And you have to see that that's the battle. No one can serve two masters. You cannot serve both God and money. And you have to ask which one is driving my life. And what this parable teaches us is that God has given it all to us. He's entrusted it to us so that we can use it well. But understand the real question this week is, will I live like it all belongs to God? So, I learned a lesson. We were driving through Memphis and we got really hungry. So we went to Genghis Grill. Any of y'all ever been to Genghis Grill? So the way it works is that you go through this line and they have all this stuff and you put it in a bowl and then they're going to saute it or whatever they do to it there at the end. But you know what Genghis Grill knows to do? Give you a small bowl and put all the stuff that doesn't really cost anything up in the front and towards the beginning. And you know what their hope is? That you'll pile your bowl full of stuff that doesn't really have much value and have no place in your bowl for the things that really do. And I wonder how many of us are living our life that way, where we're missing out on the things that really matter. Abraham, the father of the faithful, look what it says about him. He lived his whole life. He navigated wealth. He trusted that God owned it all. He lived differently than everyone else around him. And the Hebrew writer says, here's why in verse 10. He was looking forward to another city, another place, a city with foundation, whose architect and builder is God. Part of what we've got to remind ourselves is God owns it all, and it's really wonderful and beautiful, but God has something even better for us waiting if we trust him. And if we live knowing that God owns it all. So, who owns the pond? The same one who holds the future. And what he wants to know today, can we really say, in God we trust? If you've never given your life to him, that's the beginning. For many of us, this is just a call to wake up and to understand that ownership is everything, and God owns it all. How can we minister to you this morning? We're not in a hurry. Come to the front as we stand and sing.